హే గాయ్స్, ఇప్పుడు మనకు షికాగోలో ఫుల్ రెయిన్ పడుతుంది. మనం వచ్చేసి షికాగో ఆర్కిటెక్చర్ టూర్కి వెళ్ళాలి. ఇక్కడ బ్రిడ్జి డౌన్ నుంచి వెళ్ళేసి మనము అక్కడ బ్లూ జెండా దగ్గర మనకు ఒక షిప్ ఉంటుంది. ఆ షిప్లోకి వెళ్ళాలి. సో ఇదే అన్నమాట ఆ షిప్. సో ఇది 4 o'clock స్టార్ట్ అవుతుంది. మనకు బాగా వర్షం పడుతుంటే ఒక కవర్ కొన్నాము. ఆ కవర్ వేసుకొని వెళ్దామని షిప్లో. సో ఈ కవర్ని ఇట్లా పట్టుకొని షిప్లో ఎక్కుతున్నాం అనమాట. మనకు షిప్ లోపల బార్ ఉంది. ఇక్కడ డ్రింక్స్ అన్నీ ఉన్నాయి. కూల్ డ్రింక్స్ ఉన్నాయి, అట్లే హాట్ డ్రింక్స్ ఉన్నాయి. సో షిప్ పైన మనకు
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome aboard. Chicago's leading lady. Still got some time before we get underway here. So at the bar, you can make a rain poncho. Also, the restrooms are down there as well. We also have some beverages. If you like something to drink, beer, wine, soft drinks, bottles of water, snacks, coffee, tea, anything you can imagine with most of the bar we have down there. Check it out. Welcome aboard.
మనకు వీళ్ళు గైడ్ అన్నీ చెప్తుంటాడు, అవన్నీ వినాలన్నమాట. సో ఇక్కడ పైనుంచి బిల్డింగ్స్ చూపిస్తున్నాం. మన షిప్ పై నుంచి చాలా బాగుంది. షిప్ పై నుంచి ఇవన్నీ.
Well, all you got to do is just bump the seat on the deck. Most of the water falls right off, and then you can use the paper towel to wipe it off. Yeah, let up here in a sec. It's already pretty much slowed all the way down, so feel free to join us on the upper deck. We'll pass out some paper towels for you as you join us. We'll have some at the gangplank too, the place where you got on. So if you want to grab some,
latest radar weather app. I think we're going to be clear for the next at least an hour, maybe the next 90 minutes. So I invite you to join me up on deck. And the person who was considered the first permanent and non-indigenous settler in Chicago didn't arrive here until the 1780s, and he built a cabin just across the river from where we are now. See, everybody's kind of drying off their seats here on the top deck, but if you look over to your right, there is a firm. But in the 1780s, that's where a man named Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable built a cabin that was both his home as well as a trading post. And modernist buildings often have this box-like minimalist appearance. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who really popularized this style in North America. Just all on the left side, round temple on the rooftop. It's got a curved wall facing the bridge along Michigan Avenue. And just below the roof line, you see a row of beautiful Greek Corinthian columns. This is the London House Chicago from 1923, designed by Alfred L. Schuler. It's an example of the Beaux-Arts style of architecture. This has been described as, in the U.S. version of this, has been described as an American version of a French version, of a Roman version of Greek architecture. So the roots of Beaux-Arts go all the way back to ancient Greece, and then the French added many decorative flourishes such as garlands, urns, carvings along the walls. As we come out onto the bridge, you'll see carved griffins, winged lions above the doorway. Its main entranceway has more of those beautiful Greek Corinthian columns and a Roman arch over the doorway. This began its life as an office building, but is now the London House Chicago Hotel. Was remodeled and renovated in 2016, converted into a hotel. That temple on the rooftop can be rented for private events and weddings, called the Cupola. And there's also a 3-level rooftop bar and restaurant atop the hotel. Gives you great views of this part of downtown Chicago. Ahead of us on the left, there's a light brown building. It also has a round dome above the central tower and 4 small round temple figures around the 4 corners of the office block. This is the 35 East Wacker building from 1926, designed by Yaver and Dinkelberg. Those 4 corner temples around the office block, the main office block, were originally designed to conceal as well as beautify water tanks that were part of the fire suppression system for the building. And in the 1920s, it had a unique amenity, an elevator for automobiles, so you could drive an automobile right into the elevator, be hoisted up to the floor where your shop or your office was located, and then park your car on that level. That was removed in the 1940s. It seems like it was kind of a one-of-a-kind sort of invention, and operational and maintenance problems eventually led to it being removed. And as we come out from under the bridge here, if you look along the riverfront, there's a outdoor cafe, or umbrellas for an outdoor cafe on the left, and then just past that there's a little bubbling fountain that marks the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza in Chicago. That's the beginning of the downtown portion of the Chicago River Walk, the part that goes through the central business district of the city. It's a 6-block long linear park designed by the architect Carol Ross Barney. This portion of the Riverwalk was built between 2014 and 2016. These passageways underneath the bridges were the most challenging, most difficult task in terms of building a pedestrian walkway along the waterfront here of the river, not on the river bank. Ahead of us on the left, another tall rooftop of that building. It has these silver walls and gray stone work going up the side of it. This is 77 West Wacker from 1992, designed by a Catalan architect named Ricardo Bofill. This is an example of the postmodernist style. Postmodernists thought that the modern architects had gone too far in terms of stripping away ornamentation and historical references from buildings. So so Bofill calls this building a dialogue between the classicism of stone and the modernity of glass. If you look at the stonework on this building, these vertical stone lines going up the side of the building from the base all the way up to the top are designed as a series of simplified stone columns, all stacked one on top of the other, so it's an homage to that ancient building form. The pediment, or the triangular rooftop, is called a pediment, and that's familiar to us from the Parthenon in Greece, among many other ancient buildings. So some people call this building a Parthenon on stilts, or a Parthenon on steroids, but it's an example of how a modern architect could bring historical and classical architectural references into a modern glass office building. Building from 1930, designed by Oliver and Root. It's an example of the Art Deco style. These Art Deco tall buildings often emphasize the verticality of the tower, so those stone lines, those smooth stone lines going up in between the window bays are unbroken stone surfaces, kind of leading your eye upward, upward, upward toward the top of the building. And Art Deco buildings often have these cutouts and setbacks and these kind of chair shapes or other configurations. That's because city authorities, and particularly in Chicago and New York, developed zoning codes. They were afraid as buildings got taller and taller that if they were built all the way out to the property line, light and air would not be able to get down to the sidewalk where pedestrians, at the pedestrian level. So they came up with complicated zoning rules that resulted in a lot of unique Art Deco configurations. Up ahead on our left, there's another postmodern building. It has on the rooftop these kind of shapes that look a little bit like flying saucers or landing on the two corners of the building facing the river. They have these spiky antennas sticking out of them. This is another postmodern building from 1989, designed by KPF, or Cone Pedersen Fox. And our postmodernists also like to incorporate contextual references so that a building would kind of fit in with its neighborhood. This building has two specific contextual details we can see. If you look up to the very top, connecting those two towers facing the river, there's an arched bridge shape. That's a ornamental design that kind of is an acknowledgement of all the bridges that this building faces along the river. And just below that, about 6 floors below that, sitting on a ledge, there's a round urn or planter. That planter is designed very much in the shape and style that Frank Lloyd Wright used for planters on his prairie houses, which he built around the Chicago area throughout the Midwest. So two specific little details on that building to try to make it fit in with its Chicago setting. The building right next to it on the left, this green glass building with the huge curved wall along the river, is 333 West Wacker from 1983, designed by the same firm, KPF. And all of the design decisions here were based on the unique context of this graceful curving wall along the river that reflects a bend in the river that we're navigating through right now. The colors of the glass are taken from the colors of Lake Michigan and the colors of the river. And at the base of the building, you see these first 2 or 3 floors are covered with stonework. There's some light gray stone, some dark green marble. And there's an L train that runs by this building, goes by several hundred times a day. So in 1983, there wasn't soundproof glass. And so the architects moved all the mechanical floors down to the base of the building and covered them up with stone. So the tenant floors are the glass surface floors and begin up a little bit above the noise and the racket of the passing L trains. So now we're in the confluence of the river. This is where all 3 branches of the river come together. We're on the main stem now. Over on our right is the north branch. Over on our left is the south branch. And directly ahead of us, we'll be passing it on the left, is the River Point building, where here is this urban scale parabolic arch at the base of the building overlooking the confluence. Up at the rooftop, there's another curved scallop element that kind of balances this out. And it has another graceful curved wall along the river, kind of looking at its neighbor across the way, the 333 building we just saw. That bright red sculpture is done by a Spanish artist and architect named Santiago Calatrava, called Constellation. And beneath that building, on these kind of light gray walls, you see all these round porthole shapes. This building is constructed over active railroad lines. There are diesel trains that run underneath the building. So those are exhaust vents for the train traffic that runs underneath it. We're on the north branch of the river now, and we're going to chug up the north branch, and then turn around and go down the south branch a little bit later. This is where we see the largest number of remnants of the industrial past of the river. It starts on the left with this pink brick building in the distance. This is the Fulton House from 1898, the oldest building that we see, designed by Frank Abbott. And it was a cold storage warehouse, a place where refrigerated and frozen goods were stored. And in 1981, the architect Harry Weiss decided to convert it into residential loft-style apartments. So all of those balconies and windows were punched through brick walls that were 4 feet thick in this warehouse building. It took 6 months just to thaw out all of the ice that had accumulated over the decades before they could start the work on the interior of this building. As we go by the wall facing the river here, this brick wall, you see star shapes kind of laying on the surface of the brick. Those are caps on the ends of steel reinforcing rods that were inserted into the building after it thawed out to stabilize the structure. Just past this building, also on the left, a small group of townhouses that Harry Weiss also designed. These were built in 1988. They're called the River Cottages. They were based on nautical themes, sailboats and sail themes. So they have steeply pitched roofs, these triangular skylights and rooftops. There are balconies and decks facing the river, porthole windows, corkscrew staircases. So a lot of nautical themes incorporated in these townhouses. They were built in 1988, only they rarely come on the public market, and the last time that one sold publicly was in 2015, and at that time the price tag was $2.25 million for one of them. Over on our right, we see this kind of nondescript industrial building. Looks like kind of an industrial shed that we might have seen here 100 years ago. But this is actually a high-end health club called the East Bank Club. Former members include Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama, and Michael Jordan used to be a frequent visitor here as well. It was built in 1979, and there were very few windows along the riverfront when it was constructed. It kind of turned its back on the river because the river was considered a smelly, polluted, unsightly industrial corridor in the late 70s. So most of these windows were not added until about a decade later. And it was in the 1990s, the end of the 1990s, when the city council in Chicago passed an ordinance to begin to regulate riverfront development in the downtown part of Chicago. We see an example of what happened over on the left side of the boat. This is the Kinsey Park development, a residential community with these brick townhouses and this beautiful landscaped public promenade along the water. One of the provisions of this riverfront development ordinance was a requirement that new developments had to have a 30-foot or a 10-meter setback along the water that would be open space and open to public access. So this is an example of that ordinance taking effect. And in just this 25-year period from the late 70s to the early 2000s, real shipping corridor to being more of a recreational urban amenity. And it really began attracting residential development downtown. Warehouse from 1909 that's been converted to residential loft apartments. Here you see these balconies draped off the side of the building, hanging off of cables. Very common strategy in preserving and adapting these old industrial buildings for residential use. And preservationists have come up with this phrase, adaptive reuse, to describe this process of taking a building that was built for one purpose, you renovate it, you convert it to a different purpose, and you kind of make it a viable part of the city's real estate. So we've already seen an office building that's become a hotel. We've seen two different warehouses that have now been converted into residential loft-style apartments. We'll see some other examples of that, and it's really one of the ways that Chicago's been able to hold on to a lot of its vintage buildings. Over on our right, there's a tall building with a unique bracing system on the side, these kind of distinctive diagonal braces that looks a little bit like a fishbone pattern on the side of the building. This is called Erie on the Park, was built in 2002 and designed by a French-born but Chicago-based architect named Lucien Lagrange. And this is a residential building, had those diagonal braces were there partly to stiffen the wall against wind forces, so one way of dealing with wind in the windy city, but also by pushing the structure to the outside of the building, creating an exterior skeleton or an exoskeleton. It frees up the owners of the building to configure the floor plans inside in a very free and flexible way. So this has that's a residential building, and it's kind of surprising to some that the most expensive units these days are actually the units that have those diagonal braces slicing. In front of this collection of buildings, that's the only public Chicago public park that we see on this river tour, and it's named after Aaron Montgomery Ward, a person who very important in Chicago's history. I think if you're older than 50, you might have some idea of who Montgomery Ward was. If you're but he was a guy who came to Chicago just after the Civil War, traveled around small towns throughout the Midwest, and represented Chicago retailers. Realized that people in these small rural communities didn't have access to the quality of merchandise or the variety of merchandise or the low consumer prices that people in cities had. So his radical and transformative business idea was to create the world's first mail order catalog, which he did in 1872. He began with just one sheet of paper that was basically a price list, but within 20 years he was publishing a 1,000-page catalog, mailing it to millions of households around the country, and in a sense became the first national retailer in the United States. And I'm telling you about him because he built a whole campus of buildings along the riverfront here. On our right, we're going by the former headquarters and administrative office building, this kind of buff-colored building with these ornamental designs above the first floor. These are relief sculptures in the Art Deco style from 1930. Very abstract kind of geometric designs. They're sort of you can also see they carved out a riverfront promenade on the first floor, made it a covered walkway. That's another adaptive reuse project where it's an old office building that's been converted into residential living units as well. The main building of the Ward complex is this was built in 1906 to 1908, designed by Schmidt, Garden, and Martin. And they were contemporaries of Frank Lloyd Wright, Chicago area architect, who created this style called the Prairie style. He designed a lot of low horizontal we have here. So these ribbons of red brick that run along the side of the building, they go from one end to the other without a break, really emphasize the low horizontality of this quite massive building. And it's a way in which some colleagues and contemporaries of Frank Lloyd Wright borrowed some of his Prairie School design ideas and applied them to a commercial architecture project. Bezos of the 19th century, he created the Amazon.com of its time. This moment of inspiration that he had in the 1930s, which we kind of think the red nose idea came to him from the cold red noses of frigid Chicagoans wandering through the streets of the city in the depths of the Depression in the dead of winter. But nevertheless, we have Rudolph the Red-Nosed Man. That it's an unusual building in that all of the corners of the building are covered up with this travertine material on the outside and concrete reinforcing on the inside. The company executives apparently told the architect that they didn't want their employees fighting over office real estate turf, so they didn't want any corner windows. That would be the prime office locations. They wanted an egalitarian or a non-hierarchical kind of workplace environment. So that is really the only high-rise building in Chicago that has no corner windows and no corner views from the building. That too is another conversion project. It was an office building, the headquarters of the company, and it's now been converted into condominiums. It's a building called the Montgomery now today. Campus of buildings built by the Chicago Tribune for its printing plant, 10 printing presses, as well as a distribution center, and now today it's also the headquarters and the staff offices for the Chicago Tribune newspaper. This was built in 1980 by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and will probably be the last industrial property that we see along the downtown part of the riverfront. Everything since the 80s has been new residential construction downtown. But if you happen to see or handle or read, the flow in the river was reversed. One of the great civil engineering stories of the 19th century, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that happened. In the original design Mother Nature created, the flow of the river is just what you might expect. It flows into Lake Michigan naturally. Lake Michigan, if you drop a cork on the surface of Lake Michigan, eventually it will float all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. It's part of the Atlantic watershed. This was fine for thousands of years until a large city emerged on the banks of the river, and people in the city began disposing of all of their waste, and all of it was flowing into the river. There was human waste, animal waste from the stockyards, factory waste, industrial waste. Became a very polluted open sewer, as well as an industrial shipping corridor. This is how many cities treated their rivers in the 1800s, but what was problematic here is Lake Michigan has always been the source of Chicago's fresh water and our drinking water. So having an open sewer flowing into your freshwater drinking supply, that's not really good urban design, became a problem for Chicago. People in the late 1800s began getting sick and sometimes dying from epidemics of waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. So city leaders realized something had to be done in the city's flow of the river and having it drain away from Lake Michigan. And this is possible, could be done in Chicago because the city is really located on top of a major watershed divide in North America. So if you go, so as I say, the Lake Michigan drains out to the Atlantic Ocean. But if you go just 10 miles, it naturally flows west into the Mississippi River and then ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. So the idea here was to dig a trench starting at the south branch of the Chicago River. The river is very shallow, it's only about 20 feet or 7 meters deep. So they dug a trench that is twice as deep as the river, 40 feet deep. They went through that watershed divide, they kept going until they connected up with a river that naturally flowed west. It is about 30 miles long. So it's a 30-mile canal called the Chicago Sanitarian Ship Canal, and it opened in January of the year 1900. So that was the first year suddenly all of Chicago's sewage was going to be floating past communities that had never had that experience before. So people in St. Louis, which is about 350 miles from here, decided to sue the city to try to stop this project. The lawsuit went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court decided in Chicago's favor, and they actually found some evidence that the water leaving Illinois was cleaner after the project than it was before, because all that sewage was being diluted with water from Lake Michigan as well. So St. Louis has gotten a measure of payback because they've been taking advantage of all this free water we've been sending them for the past 120 years. St. Louis, famous brewing town, the home of Budweiser beer, so they've been using our water supply to feed their breweries, bottle it up, put a Budweiser or Bud Light label on it, and sell it back to us in Chicago at a very steep markup from what we originally sent it to them as. But that's the brief version of how the river flow was reversed. And just ahead of us, we see the only bridge that we always see. Bridges all have counterweights in the river bank, so there's a huge block of concrete painted a yellow color there that is the counterweight that rocks that bridge into the open and closed position. They're called Fascicule Bridges, and Fascicule is a French word that means rocker or seesaw. Every bridge we go under downtown is an operable bridge. They all open for boat traffic throughout the summer and throughout the winter months as well. But the rail company that owns it is still keeping it in service, or still keeping it commissioned, maybe brought back into service sometime in the future. But nowadays it's always up unless it's down for federal safety inspections once or twice a year. And just ahead of us on the right, there's the most unique foundation of any building that we pass by, shaped a little bit like a martini glass or a funnel or a golf tee. And this is the 150 North Riverside building from 2017. It's a 54-story office building, but the only part of the building that goes into the ground for the foundation is the center portion of the building behind that gray stone wall. So the foundation only occupies about 30% of the floor space that all of the office floors up above it occupy. There's no perimeter wall or perimeter foundation that supports the exterior of this building. It was devised by Seattle-based engineers named Magnuson Clemenza. They came up with this idea to squeeze a big building onto this small site. This is also a site that a lot of there are rail lines here, so there's rail traffic that goes by here. So they had limited space for the foundation. They came up with this solution. Of course, they also had to provide the 30-foot or the 10-meter setback along the riverfront. Here we actually have a double-decked river walk. One river walk at the water level and another one up in the street. For the architects, they also designed on our right this next modern glass building that we go by. It has kind of a sawtooth-shaped facade along the water. This is the Bank of America Tower that was just completed in 2020. And again, they had this challenge of a very small site on the river. They wanted to build a tall office building. They had to provide a 30-foot promenade for pedestrians. So they reached a compromise with city planners. Instead of having an open to the sky promenade as the ordinance requires, they created this 60-foot high or 17-meter high overhang, and then these totally awesome trident-shaped columns. So instead of having kind of a wall of columns along the riverfront here, they're pinched together in these three little foundation points to create as open and spacious a feeling for the Riverwalk traffic here as possible. Our local architecture critic called this building a ground scraper rather than a skyscraper because all of the razzle-dazzle is